class, welcome back. Today's lesson is going to focus on causes of disease. So, diseases are caused typically by three things. Two things that we've already kind of talked about, and then one thing that is the focus of this unit because it's new. So, we know that nutrient deficiencies happen. Okay? Animals get sick because they're under consuming key nutrients, or in some cases, actually over consuming, but it's much less common. Okay? We also know that nutrient deficiencies cause lots of different issues. Every different nutrient, including every different vitamin and every different mineral, is going to affect some different kind of internal process in that animal, depending on what the job of that nutrient, vitamin, mineral, what have you, does in the animal. Okay. Not only does that happen, but as I mentioned in our last lesson, okay, bad nutrition doesn't just affect like those specific things those nutrients do, but it also affects the immune system. Anytime that an animal isn't getting all the right amounts of things that it needs to stay healthy, it puts the body in a stressful state because the body's trying to keep that animal alive as best as possible with whatever resources it has. Okay. The immune system is usually one of the first things to falter because it is one of the first things that loses resources as the animal is trying to keep homeostasis going, okay, trying to maintain that maintenance function. So if an animal's not getting all the stuff they need, their immune system doesn't have the energy and the ability to fight off other infectious diseases. Okay. We also know from last unit that what an animal needs varies widely based on their age, based on what we're using them for, based on whether or not they're being bred or feeding offspring, etc. Okay? But every animal needs a good balance of those 6 essential nutrients. Okay? So water plus the 5 things listed here: vitamins, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and minerals. Every single one of them has an important role or multiple important roles that they play in the body. And when you don't have them, the body gets stressed, and stressed animals can very easily become sick animals. Genetics also can cause diseases. When we talked about genetics a couple of units ago, 2 units ago now, okay, we looked at the goal of genetics and animal science being to improve offspring by breeding the 2 best parents. But even when we put all of our effort into trying to make sure that we get the best babies, okay, whether those are foals or calves or humans or whatever, sometimes DNA doesn't work the way we want it to. So either there's a DNA mutation that randomly gets passed on to the offspring, or in some cases, the parents might just have recessive copies of the genes that now the offspring gets both those recessive copies, which means they get that health problem. Okay? Genetics and nutrition are not the things we're going to talk about in this unit, as I mentioned in our last lesson. They're important to understand. They're a part of this conversation about animal health, but they're not going to be our focus. So, our focus is really going to be on diseases caused by pathogens, infectious diseases, those that we can pass on or animals can pass on to one another through all those methods we looked at in our previous lesson. So, a pathogen is going to be a term that we use. It's a broad term that describes any organism, anything that exists in some cases outside the animal that can get into their body and make them sick. Okay. Pathogens can be microscopic or they can be macroscopic. Microscopic means that they're little. Okay. We can't see them with our naked eye. Okay. Most bacteria and viruses, those are going to be microscopic. You've got to look for them in a microscope, quite frankly, as you can see in the picture. If you've ever had to take a fecal sample to a vet, and they're looking for big things you can see, like worms, which are macroscopic, you can see them with your own eye, but they're also looking for things that are microscopic, things that are too small. So they're going to take that fecal sample, and once they've looked through it and they haven't noticed any macroscopic items, they're going to put a little bit of that fecal sample onto a slide, and they're going to look for the little things too. Okay? So we have 5 major classifications of pathogens that cause the vast majority of diseases in animals, both zoonotic diseases and also non-zoonotic diseases. So those that only pass between animals within one species or sometimes multiple species. So the first are viruses. Okay, viruses are unique and interesting if you remember back to your biology class, and that viruses are classified as non-living things, but they do some things living things do, and they do some things that living things don't do. The big thing to know about viruses, or the important thing that makes them distinct, is that they can't reproduce without a host. Okay, they can't do stuff unless they're inside of an organism because they're basically going to take over the cells of that organism and use them to multiply and basically wreak havoc. Okay, viruses consist strictly of DNA and RNA in a protein coat. Okay, they get inside an organism, they interrupt cell function, they take over the cell to multiply, and they basically mess things up. Okay? Different viruses cause different problems based on what kind of cells they're trying to target. Bacteria are single celled organisms. These are going to be, again, some of the microscopic, so we're viruses. Bacteria can harm in a lot of different ways, but generally speaking, they're going to make that animal sick once they're inside the body, either because they're triggering the immune system, they're disrupting the function of a particular organ, and in some cases, they actually as they go through their life cycle, they make toxins or kind of like poisons that hurt the body. Bacteria do not need a host to multiply. They multiply really easily without one. They can do that on surfaces, but then they also can obviously continue to multiply when they get inside an organism. Typically speaking, we classify and identify organism or bacterial organisms by their shape. So different classes of different bacteria are basically what they look like. So for example, Streptococcus is a whole host of bacteria that cause things like strep throat and lots of other diseases, and they are identified based on their cone shape. Okay, so cocci are the spherical shaped bacteria, bacilli are rod shaped, and then we have spiral shaped bacteria. Okay. Next, we have parasites. Parasites are generally speaking going to be macroscopic. There are some that are pretty tiny and difficult to see, but they are generally macroscopic. And parasites can either be external or internal. So they can be found on animals or they can be found in animals. Typically speaking, they're going to affect and disrupt their host by contact or ingestion. So either they're going to embed themselves in the outside of the animal's body or they're going to get ingested into the body and burrow into tissue somewhere. Okay. Because they're larger, they don't generally work at a cellular level. They're disrupting large swaths of the animal's body. Different parasites have different life cycles. Some of those life cycles require them to be inside a certain animal at a certain stage of their life in order to reproduce or to continue to develop. Parasites are definitely living organisms, as are bacteria. These are going to be things like worms and ticks. Those are parasites. Okay, ticks are living on the outside of an animal. Most worms are going to be living on the inside, like heartworm I mentioned in the last lesson is an internal parasite. So typically speaking, the general life cycle of a parasite, this differs a little bit between species because they'll have some extra parts inside the parasite growth stage where they might have to be in another organism. But generally speaking, we have parasites inside a host. That host uses the bathroom, produces feces. You've got the eggs of that parasite in the feces. Okay, they go through a growth stage either outside, like in the soil on plants, or sometimes like in a vector, like a mosquito or a mouse. But then they live inside that animal. They get defecated out in their feces, or in some cases, they get passed because they bite the host. And then that host somehow either ingests that parasite or again gets it injected into them from a vector. External parasites, same idea. Adults are living outside. They're actually going to produce their eggs then outside. They go through a larval growth stage. They have what's called a nymph stage, which is basically where they grow from larva to something with like a hard outer coat, often something with wings, and then they become adults, and then they infect by latching on when an animal comes in contact either with another animal that has that parasite or they brush up against that parasite in its natural habitat, like ticks. Fungi. Fungi are a different type of organism. They're also living organisms. They can live in the air, they can live in soil, they can live in plants, and they often will also live in water. They generally transmit via spores. So this is part of their breeding habits as they produce these spores that get into the air or soil or plants or water again, and then animals accidentally consume them either by coming in contact, breathing them in, or ingesting them, and then they multiply in the body and cause health issues. Okay. The last one we have are called protozoas. They are another type of organism. They're a single cell organism. They do a lot of things that make them look and act very similar to multi-celled organisms like parasites, and they're classified in lots of different types. But these again are another thing that's going to make animals sick, either because they ingest them or they get on their skin and sometimes burrow into the skin. Okay, so lots of different types of pathogens. Within all of those pathogens, there are dozens and hundreds of different diseases that they cause, but the transmission of these pathogens from one organism to another is how animals get sick. Remember when we talked about the disease triangle, there are three things you need. You need a pathogen. Okay, you need one of these living organisms that's in a suitable environment so that it can then, third leg of the triangle, come in contact with and invade a susceptible host. Okay, now one last important thing to note. Okay, you've got all of these different types of pathogens. Okay, not all of these pathogens affect all animals. Some pathogens are pretty wide, cast a pretty wide net. They're able to go through their life cycle and infect lots of different organisms, but some are really specialized. There are some different pathogens that only affect one species or they only infect a handful of species. Rabies is a bacterial condition. No, rabies is a virus, excuse me. Rabies is a virus, but it is a virus that only affects mammals. So while that's a huge group of organisms, okay, there's lots of different mammal species, thousands of them, but there's a lot more other things, birds, reptiles, etc., that are not getting affected. Okay, so these are our pathogens, our common pathogens that cause disease. As we learn a little bit more about some different diseases, or as you learn a little bit more about some different diseases, you'll hopefully notice what kind of pathogen is causing that disease. Okay, so if you have any questions, as always, let your animal science teacher know. Good luck. You're going to have a lab the next couple days that are going to look at the spread of disease through some different kinds of pathogens that affect different types or different health issues. So good luck. Take care, guys, and I will see you later.